the most powerful response is not reacting at all. Let's break it down together. In a world that often rewards loudness, quick responses, and outward displays of strength, the idea of courage being found in stillness can seem counterintuitive. Yet, it is in this quiet space where we resist the impulse to react that true bravery resides. It's a type of courage that doesn't scream for attention, but instead whispers to the soul, reminding us that we don't need to meet aggression with aggression or hurt with retaliation to affirm our worth or maintain our dignity. When someone hurts us, the first instinct is often to respond immediately, to defend ourselves, to strike back, or to demand justice. And while these reactions might feel satisfying in the moment, they rarely lead to the outcomes we hoped for. Instead, they can perpetuate a cycle of conflict, resentment, and pain. The real challenge lies in resisting that immediate urge to react. It's in the moments when our hearts are most wounded that we are called to demonstrate the deepest form of courage, the courage to stay still, to sit with our discomfort, and to respond with intention rather than impulse. The stillness is not about suppression or avoidance. It is not pretending we aren't hurt or denying the pain we feel. On the contrary, it's about acknowledging that hurt fully, but choosing not to let that hurt control us. This type of courage requires immense self-awareness and discipline. It means recognizing the reacting in the heat of the moments that may the outcomes that don't align with our true values or long-term goals. There is power in taking a step back and allowing yourself the space to process what has happened. In that stillness, we can gain clarity about the situation. We can see the hurt from a distance without being consumed by it. We begin to understand that the hurt someone inflicts on us often has more to do with their own internal struggles than it does with us. When we react immediately, we become entangled in their pain, and we risk taking on emotions and battles that aren't ours to carry. In stillness, we find perspective. We start to recognize the difference between what is truly ours to own and what belongs to someone else. We can acknowledge our pain without allowing it to define us. We can see that reacting to every slighter hurt does not make us stronger or more in control. It often makes us feel even more powerless. When we pause, when we allow ourselves to be still, we are saying, I am in control of my response. I won't let someone else dictate my emotional state. This stillness allows us to respond from a place of strength and self-respect. When we react impulsively, it's often because we feel threatened. But when we are able to remain still, we tap into a deeper sense of security within ourselves. We realize that our worth is not determined by how others treat us. Our sense of self is not dependent on external validation or approval. In this space of stillness, we find the confidence to stand in our truth, even when others try to tear us down. One of the hardest things to accept is that we cannot control how others behave. We can't control whether someone hurts us or betrays us. What we can control is how we choose to respond. And choosing stillness is one of the most powerful responses we can make. It shows that we refuse to be pulled into someone else's negativity or chaos. It shows that we value our peace more than we value being right or vindicated in the eyes of others. Stillness is also an act of self-compassion. When we react immediately to hurt, we often do so from a place of fear or insecurity. We might feel the need to defend ourselves because we fear that we are not enough, or we fear that others will see us as weak if we don't fight back. Stillness says, I am enough just as I am. I don't need to prove my worth to anyone. It's an act of self-love that allows us to prioritize our own well-being over the need to be seen or heard in the heat of the moment. This does not mean that we should never speak up or assert ourselves when we are hurt. It doesn't mean that we should always remain silent in the face of injustice or mistreatment. There are times when we need to stand up for ourselves and set boundaries, but the key is to do so from a place of calm and clarity, rather than from a place of reactionary emotion. When we choose stillness first, we give ourselves the opportunity to respond with intention rather than impulse. We can assert our needs and express our feelings in a way that is grounded in our values, rather than being driven by the heat of the moment. And there's a saying that goes, in stillness, we find our strength. This is especially true when it comes to emotional resilience. It takes incredible strength to resist the urge to react when someone hurts us. It takes strength to sit with our pain and not let it consume us. It takes strength to trust that we don't need to react to every hurtful word or action in order to maintain our sense of self-worth. Stillness also allows us to cultivate empathy and understanding. When we take a step back from our immediate emotional response, we can begin to see the situation from a broader perspective. We might recognize that the person who hurt us is also coming from a place of pain or insecurity. We might see that their actions are not a reflection of our worth, but rather a reflection of their own struggles. This doesn't mean that we excuse harmful behavior, but it does allow us to respond with more compassion and less judgment. It allows us to break the cycle of hurt and retaliation and instead choose a path of healing and growth. Choosing stillness is an act of bravery because it requires us to face our emotions head on. It requires us to sit with our discomfort rather than numbing it with distraction or reaction. It requires us to trust that we are strong enough to handle our pain without lashing out or seeking revenge. This is not an easy thing to do. In fact, it may be one of the hardest things we will ever do, but it is also one of the most transformative. When we practice stillness in the face of hurt, we begin to build emotional resilience. We start to see that we are capable of withstanding difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. We realize that we don't need to react to every negative situation in order to protect ourselves. Instead, we learn to trust in our own inner strength and wisdom. We learn to trust that we can navigate difficult situations with grace and integrity without being pulled into the chaos of others. Stillness also gives us the opportunity to heal. When we react immediately to hurt, we often act from a place of unhealed wounds. We might lash out because we are still carrying the pain of past hurts or because we fear being hurt again in the future. But when we choose stillness, we give ourselves the space to process our emotions and begin the healing process. We can acknowledge our pain without letting it control us. We can take the time to reflect on what we truly need in order to heal rather than reacting out of a place of fear or anger. When we think about courage, we often envision grand, heroic acts, someone stepping into a dangerous situation to save a life, or boldly standing up against an injustice. These are indeed acts of bravery, but they are only one facet of courage. There is another quieter kind of bravery, one that doesn't get the same attention, that is equally powerful. This is the courage to be still in the face of emotional adversity, the courage to pause when every fiber of our being wants to react. This kind of courage is deeply personal, often invisible, but it's where true growth and transformation happen. The choice not to react when hurt is not about being passive or allowing others to walk over us. It is, in fact, a radical act of self-love and self-respect. In moments of stillness, we can reclaim our power, not the power to dominate others, but the power to control our own emotional landscape. It's about saying to yourself, I won't let someone else dictate how I feel or how I act. I am in control of my own emotional destiny. This is a profound realization, and it's a cornerstone of emotional maturity. Consider for a moment the typical human response to being hurt. Often we react because we want to alleviate our own pain. If someone says something cruel, our instinct might be to fire back with a remark that hurts them equally, or to defend ourselves aggressively in an attempt to restore our pride. But what does this accomplish? In most cases, it only escalates the situation. Both parties walk away feeling more hurt, more misunderstood, and more entrenched in their positions. In contrast, choosing stillness allows us to break the cycle. It interrupts the knee-jerk reaction and gives us the time and space to process what has happened. It allows us to ask ourselves important questions. What am I really feeling right now? Why does this hurt so much? Is this person's behavior a reflection of me, or is it coming from their own issues? These are questions that we can only answer when we create space between the hurt and the response. This space is crucial because it's where self-reflection happens. In the heat of the moment, we are often too blinded by our own pain to see the situation clearly. But in stillness, we gain perspective. we can step back and see the bigger picture. We begin to realize that our initial impulse to react might not actually serve our best interests in the long run. Instead of feeding into the conflict, we can choose to disengage, to protect our peace, and to respond from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity. When we talk about owning our emotional landscape, we're diving into something incredibly profound and transformative. It's about taking full responsibility for the way we feel, the way we react, and how we process the events of our lives. This is not always an easy task. It requires a level of self-awareness and bravery that, at times, can feel overwhelming. But the reward is a life lived on our terms, one where our emotions don't run wild, where external forces don't dictate how we show up in the world, and where we reclaim the power to shape our own narrative. There's a common misconception that our emotions are controlled by the circumstances of our lives, by the people around us, or by the situations we find ourselves in. We think, if only that hadn't happened, I wouldn't feel this way, or if only that person hadn't said those hurtful words, I wouldn't be upset. But when we truly begin to own our emotional landscape, we start to understand that no one else is responsible for how we feel, only we are. The words, actions, or circumstances that surround us might trigger emotions, but how we choose to respond to those emotions, how we navigate, how we let them impact our lives is entirely up to us. This kind of ownership is a radical shift in how we approach life. It means stepping out of the victim mindset where we feel like things happen to us, and instead stepping into a mindset of personal power and accountability. It's about saying, I may not be able to control what happens, but I am absolutely in control of how I choose to respond. And that shift, while subtle, has the power to change everything. Owning our emotional landscape doesn't mean that we suppress or ignore our feelings. On the contrary, it's about recognizing and fully acknowledging what we feel. But instead of letting those emotions dictate our behavior or define our reality, we take responsibility for how we engage with them. We don't shove them aside, nor do we let them run wild and unchecked. Instead, we sit with them, we understand them, we make conscious decisions about how to respond to them. This is where true emotional freedom comes from. It's not about controlling or manipulating how we feel, but about learning how to work with our emotions rather than being at their mercy. Imagine a scenario where someone you care about says something hurtful. The instinctive reaction might be to feel anger or sadness, and that's completely natural. But instead of immediately reacting either by lashing out, shutting down, or letting those feelings dictate your behavior, you take a moment to step back. You ask yourself, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling that? Why? Maybe the hurtful words struck a nerve because they touched on a deep-seated insecurity or an unresolved issue from your past. By owning your emotional landscape, you allow yourself the space to explore what's really going on beneath the surface, instead of just reacting impulsively. This process of self-exploration is essential. When we don't own our emotional landscape, we often react without understanding the deeper layers of our feelings. We might lash out in anger when really what we're feeling is fear. We might withdraw when underneath it all we're craving connection. But when we take ownership of our emotions, we begin to understand that there's always more going on beneath the surface. And by taking the time to uncover what that is, we can respond in a way that's aligned with our true needs and desires. One of the most powerful aspects of owning our emotional landscape is that it allows us to break free from old patterns and narratives. So often our emotional reactions are tied to past experiences, things that happened long ago, but continue to shape how we show up in the present. Maybe we've been hurt in the past and now we react defensively whenever we feel vulnerable. Or maybe we've been conditioned to believe that showing emotion is a sign of weakness, so we shut down when we feel overwhelmed. But when we take ownership of our emotions, we start to see these patterns for what they are. We recognize that while our past may have shaped us, it doesn't have to define us. We have the power to rewrite the script, to choose a different response, and to create a new way of being. Owning your emotional landscape also requires a deep sense of self-compassion. It's not about blaming yourself for feeling a certain way or judging yourself for your emotional responses. Rather, it's about treating yourself with kindness and understanding as you navigate the complex terrain of your feelings. We're all human, and we're all going to have moments where we feel overwhelmed, frustrated, or hurt. The key is not to punish ourselves for feeling those emotions, but to recognize them as part of the human experience and to approach you rather than judgment. When we own our emotions, we also give ourselves permission to fully experience them. We allow our state to feel without shame or guilt. Too often, we try to numb or distract ourselves from uncomfortable emotions because we've been taught that certain feelings like sadness, anger, fear about it are unacceptable. But the truth is, all emotions serve a purpose. They are signals guiding us toward a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. By owning our emotional landscape, we learn to listen to these signals and to use them as tools for growth and self-awareness. Another profound aspect of owning your emotional landscape is how it impacts your relationships. When you take responsibility for your emotions, you no longer place the burden of your feelings on others. You no longer expect someone else to make you happy or blame them for making you upset. This doesn't mean that other people's actions don't affect you, but it does mean that you recognize that your emotions are yours to manage. This shift can lead to healthier, more fulfilling relationships because it allows for open, honest communication without the need for blame or resentment. When we don't own our emotions, we often fall into the trap of believing that others are responsible for how we feel. We might think, if only my partner were more attentive, I'd be happy, or if only my boss appreciated me more, I wouldn't feel so frustrated. But this way of thinking is a recipe for disappointment because it places our emotional well-being in the hands of others. By taking ownership of our emotional landscape, we reclaim that power. We recognize that while others can influence our emotions, they are not responsible for them. We are. And that's a liberating realization. In owning your emotions, you also learn the importance of setting boundaries, not just with others, but with yourself. You begin to recognize when certain situations or people trigger negative emotions, and you take proactive steps to protect your emotional well-being. This might mean removing yourself from toxic environments, or it might mean changing the way you engage with certain people. It's not about shutting others out, but about creating a space where you can engage with the world in a word-inner way that honors your emotional needs and values. This process of boundary setting is an essential part of emotional ownership because it teaches you to prioritize your well-being without waiting for others to change their behavior. It's about recognizing that you are responsible for your emotional health, and that means making choices that support that health. Whether it's choosing to walk away from a toxic situation or simply choosing not to react to someone else's negativity, setting these boundaries is an act of self-respect. Another critical component of owning your emotional landscape is learning how to manage your emotional energy. Just as we manage our time and physical energy, it's essential to be mindful of how we expend emotional energy. When we allow ourselves to be constantly reactive, we drain our emotional reserves. But when we take ownership of our emotional landscape, we become more intentional about where and how we invest our emotional energy. We learn to conserve it for the things that truly matter, our passions, our relationships, our personal growth, rather than wasting it on things or people that don't serve us. This is not to say that owning your emotions is about being detached or indifferent. Far from it. It's about being fully engaged with life while maintaining control over how you allow it to affect you. It's about being deeply present with your emotions without letting them dictate your actions or define your experience. It's about feeling fully and responding intentionally. There's immense power in knowing that no matter what happens in your life, you are in control of how you respond. Life will inevitably bring challenges, disappointments, and pain. But by owning your emotional landscape, you equip yourself with the tools to navigate these challenges with grace and resilience. You become the architect of your emotional world rather than a passive participant. This journey of emotional ownership is not always easy. It requires constant self-reflection, patience, and practice. But the more you commit to it, the more you will find that you are capable of navigating life's ups and downs with a sense of inner peace and empowerment. You will no longer be at the mercy of external circumstances or other people's actions. Instead, you will stand firmly in your emotional truth, knowing that you have the power to choose how you feel, how you respond, and how you move forward. When we think about the word vulnerability, it often conjures up images of weakness or exposure. It's a word that makes many of us uncomfortable, one that we associate with feelings of insecurity, fear, and the risk of getting hurt. But what if we've been looking at vulnerability all wrong? What if instead of seeing it as a liability, we could learn to see it as one of the greatest strengths we possess? What if vulnerability in all its rawness and openness is actually a superpower? Vulnerability is often misunderstood because it requires us to be open to be seen as we are, without the armor of perfection or the masks we wear to protect ourselves from judgment. It's the willingness to show up as our full, authentic selves, even when we're not sure how we'll be received. That can be terrifying, but there's something extraordinary about vulnerability that most people overlook. It's the birthplace of connection, courage, and true strength. It's where the magic happens. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we are saying, this is who I am, with all my imperfections and fears. And in that moment, we step into an incredible kind of power, the power to be real. When we embrace vulnerability, we stop trying to control how others perceive us. And we start living more authentically. That authenticity is magnetic because it allows others to see us for who we truly are, not for the facade we've created. It's in those moments of vulnerability that we foster deep, meaningful connections with others. Vulnerability isn't about being emotional or falling apart. It's about being honest with ourselves and others. It's about admitting when we don't have all the answers or when we're scared or uncertain. And in that honesty, we find the courage to keep moving forward despite the fear. There's a profound strength that comes from allowing ourselves to be seen in our most authentic form, without pretense or the need to be perfect. Too often we equate vulnerability with weakness because we associate it with moments when we've been hurt or let down. We remember the times when we've opened up to someone only to have our trust broken. But vulnerability isn't about avoiding pain. It's about embracing the full spectrum of human emotions, knowing that we can handle whatever comes our way. It's about trusting ourselves enough to take emotional risks, understanding that while there may be moments of hurt, there are also opportunities for deep joy, connection, and growth. I think about the most courageous people you know. Chances are they aren't the ones who walk through life pretending to have it all together. They're the ones who are willing to show up, even when it's hard, even when they don't have all the answers. They're the people who are brave enough to say, I don't know, or I need help, or I'm struggling. That's what true courage looks like. It's not about being invincible. It's about being willing to be vulnerable, to take the risk of being hurt because the potential for connection and growth is worth it. Vulnerability is at the core of every meaningful human experience. It's what makes love possible. It's what allows us to create deep, authentic relationships. Without vulnerability, there can be no true intimacy, no genuine connection. It's what gives us the ability to empathize with others and to be present in our own lives. When we shut down vulnerability, we shut down our capacity for joy, love, and belonging. But the fear of vulnerability is real, and it's something we all struggle with. We've been conditioned to believe that vulnerability is dangerous, that it's something to be avoided because it leaves us open to rejection or judgment. We live in a world that values certainty and strength, and vulnerability is often seen as the opposite of those things. But the truth is, vulnerability requires more strength than we often realize. It takes an immense amount of courage to show up as we are without the protection of certainty or control. We can't talk about vulnerability without acknowledging the fear that comes with it. It's the fear of being judged, of being rejected, of not being enough. And those fears are real, they're deeply ingrained in us. But here's the thing, by avoiding vulnerability, we don't protect ourselves from those fears. We actually give them more power over us. The more we avoid being vulnerable, the more we reinforce the belief that we're not enough as we are, that we need to hide parts of ourselves to be accepted. But what if we flip that narrative? What if instead of seeing vulnerability as something to fear, we saw it as the gateway to everything we want in life? What if we started to believe that vulnerability is where our true strength lies? Because the truth is, the most powerful, impactful moments in our lives are the ones where we've allowed ourselves to be vulnerable, whether it's telling someone we love them, asking for help when we need it, or sharing a part of ourselves that we've kept hidden. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we give others permission to do the same. We create a space where authenticity can thrive, where people can show up as they are without fear of judgment. And that's where real connection happens. It's in those moments of vulnerability that we find the courage to be ourselves and to invite others to do the same. There's a freedom that comes with vulnerability, a lightness that comes from shedding the armor we've been carrying around. When we stop trying to protect ourselves from every possible hurt or disappointment, we open ourselves up to the possibility of experiencing life more fully. We start to see that the things we thought would break us don't have the power to do so. We realize that we are capable of handling whatever comes our way, not because we're invincible, but because we're willing to be vulnerable. This isn't to say that vulnerability isn't scary. It is. It requires us to step into uncertainty, to take risks, and to trust that even if things don't turn out the way we hoped, we'll be okay. But the alternative, living a life where we never let ourselves be fully seen, where we hold back from connection and authenticity, is far scarier. Because in that space of fear and avoidance, we never truly live. We stay stuck, we miss out on opportunities for connection, growth, and joy. There's also an important connection between vulnerability and creativity. Every creation, whether it's writing a book, starting a business, or simply sharing an idea, requires vulnerability. It requires putting something out into the world without knowing how it will be received. That's what makes creativity so powerful and so terrifying, but it's also what makes it so necessary. Without vulnerability, there is no innovation, no progress, no growth. Vulnerability is the fuel that drives creativity because it allows us to take risks, to put ourselves out there, and to try something new. It's also essential to recognize that vulnerability is not something we do once and then check off our list. It's a practice, something we have to commit to every day. It's a choice we make in each moment, whether to show up fully or to retreat into the safety of our defenses. And it's a practice that requires self-compassion, because there will be times when it feels too hard, when we stumble, when we retreat back into old patterns of fear and avoidance. But that's okay. Vulnerability is not about perfection. It's about showing up even when it's hard. What's remarkable about vulnerability is that over time it strengthens us. The more we practice being vulnerable, the more we realize that we are capable of handling whatever comes our way. And we start to see that vulnerability doesn't weaken us, it builds our resilience. It teaches us that we can survive being hurt or rejected, and that those moments of pain don't define us. They're just part of the process, part of the journey toward living a fuller, more authentic life. When we embrace vulnerability, we also become more compassionate, not just toward others, but toward ourselves. We stop expecting ourselves to have it all together all the time, and we allow ourselves to be human. We give ourselves permission to make mistakes, to be imperfect, to not know all the answers. And in doing so, we create space for growth, for learning, and for deeper connection with ourselves and others. At its core, vulnerability is about being brave enough to be seen, really seen. It's about showing up in the world as our true selves, without hiding, without pretending. And that takes tremendous courage, but it's also where the most beautiful, meaningful moments of life happen. It's where we find connection, love, and belonging. It's where we discover our true strength, not in our ability to be perfect or invulnerable, but in our willingness to be real, to be open, to be vulnerable. Vulnerability isn't just a superpower, it's the key to living a life of authenticity, connection, and purpose. It's the courage to show up, even when we're scared. It's the strength to be ourselves, even when it's uncomfortable. And it's the willingness to embrace the full spectrum of human experience, knowing that in doing so, we unlock the greatest power of all, the power to live fully, deeply, and authentically. When someone hurts us, the instinct to react is powerful. It feels like we need to defend ourselves, prove something, or strike back to regain control. But in those moments, reacting often keeps us locked in a cycle of pain and disconnection. It's easy to let someone else's actions dictate our emotions, to give away our power by allowing their words or behavior to trigger us. But the truth is, we don't have to react. We can choose a different path. We can choose stillness, reflection, and most importantly, self-compassion. Choosing not to react doesn't mean we ignore our hurt or suppress our feelings. It means we pause, take a breath, and ask ourselves what we need most in that moment. It's about understanding that our worth isn't tied to how others treat us. By not reacting, so we create space to honor our emotions without letting them control us. We allow ourselves the freedom to respond from a place of strength and clarity, not fear or defensiveness. In choosing stillness, we reclaim our power. We remind ourselves that we are in charge of our emotional landscape, that we can decide how we want to engage with the world, no matter how others behave. There's a quiet courage in that, a courage that doesn't need to be loud or retaliatory, but grounded in self-awareness and love. So when hurt comes, as it inevitably will, choose the path of grace. Let stillness be your guide. In those moments, you're not avoiding conflict, you're choosing to rise above it. You're choosing to protect your peace, to act with intention, and to honor the strength within you that doesn't need to react to be powerful. That's the real power, knowing that your worth, your peace, and your heart are yours to protect, no matter what anyone else does. In the quiet of not reacting, we find our true strength. It's in those moments of stillness. We resist the pull to lash out or defend, that we discover the depth of our resilience. By choosing not to react, we allow ourselves to break free from the control that hurt tries to impose on us. We become more than the pain inflicted. We become the authors of our own emotional story. This choice doesn't mean we accept being hurt or tolerate disrespect. This shows we understand that our power lies in how we respond, not in matching someone else's behavior. When we choose to rise above reaction, we honor our own boundaries, we protect our own peace, and we open the door to healing. In doing so, we model a different way of being, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. We show that true strength is measured not by how quickly we can retaliate, but by how deeply we can maintain our integrity and self-respect. That's where our true power lies, in the ability to stay rooted in who we are, even in the face of hurt. And when we choose that, we stand unshaken, knowing that no external force can take away the strength that comes from within.